"Pack your things," Judson Hale said. "You'll be gone by sunrise." The words hit Bina like a slap, and she froze mid-motion, her hands still gripping the wire she had been tightening around a fence post. She hadn't expected this. Not today. Not after all the time she'd spent here. Not after 3 months of mending fences, cooking meals, and trying her best to stay invisible in a place where no one had ever asked anything of her, except to fix what was broken. But now, as Judson stood in the doorway of the cabin, his back turned, fists clenched at his sides, he had delivered the one order that could tear everything apart. Bina's breath caught, and for a long moment, she simply stared at him, her mind racing. Why now? She thought. What had changed? The past few days had been different. She could feel in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the small kindnesses, like the quilt he had left near her bed one cold night, the extra portion of food he gave her at dinner, and the rare but lingering glances when she worked on the fences. Her hands trembled, but she made no move. Instead, she focused on the task in front of her, the same task she had been performing day after day. She reached for the pliers on the bench, her fingers gripping them tightly, as if she could somehow squeeze the knot in her chest away. The wind howled outside, and, in the distance, the sound of hooves echoed across the quiet land. The horses were getting closer, and with them, something else. Judson didn't move. He stood there, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't say. Her heart twisted at the sight of him, and she knew that whatever decision he had made was eating him up inside. He didn't want her to go, but he had to send her away. Bina took a slow, steadying breath and then began to gather her things. The quilt he'd given her weeks ago, she folded it carefully, as though it were precious, even though it wasn't much more than a piece of cloth in the grand scheme of things. Her spare dress, worn but still functional, was next. She didn't own much, just a few simple items, but everything had a story, a reason. She picked up her fence repair tools and gently cleaned them, as she always did at the end of a long day. Her hands had grown accustomed to the weight of them, and she knew every inch of each tool, every curve and handle. It was a connection to her mother's ranch, a bond she had never expected to find again. Bina worked in silence, methodical, quiet. She had learned to stay invisible in this house, to keep her distance and not stir trouble. But today it was different. She could feel Judson's eyes on her even when he didn't speak, could hear the unspoken words in the silence between them. She wasn't sure how long she had been here, how long she had been living like this, working from dawn till dusk, staying out of his way, never asking for anything. But it hadn't been easy. No, nothing about this life had been easy. She hadn't expected it to be. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. She had thought, just for a moment, that maybe it was enough. That maybe she had found something here. But now it was over. The weight of the moment felt heavier than anything she had ever felt. Bina didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't ask for explanations. Instead, she finished gathering the few things that had made this place a home, even if only for a short time. She didn't want to look at him, didn't want to see the regret or guilt or anything else in his eyes. She had learned not to rely on him for anything, especially not the things that truly mattered. But the words he had said to her, so cold and final, broke her heart in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Hale," she said quietly, almost as a whisper to herself. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe it was because she didn't want to leave with nothing but bitterness. Maybe it was because, despite everything, she had learned something from him over the last few months. Something she wasn't sure how to name. His voice cracked, rough and low, as he turned away. "Don't thank me," he growled, his back still to her. His fists clenched again, and she could hear the anger in his tone, the frustration, the conflict. She could feel it in the very air between them. But it didn't change anything. The moment had come. Bina's hands worked quickly as she finished gathering the last of her things. She stood, ready to go, to leave everything behind. The wind howled louder now, and the sound of the horse's hooves grew closer, faster, more urgent. Judson turned back toward the window, staring out into the night, his expression unreadable. But Bina knew, deep down, that he wasn't just thinking about her. He was thinking about what would happen when the riders arrived. 3, maybe 4 of them. And they weren't here to bring supplies or offer a friendly visit. They were coming for her, for the girl who had tried to fix his fences and mended something far deeper than a broken post. Judson's heart was beating in his chest, faster, harder, and he could feel the panic rising, even as he fought it. He couldn't stop them. He couldn't protect her. He had already made his decision. It was too late to change it now. But as the hooves grew louder, the truth hit him like a blow to the chest. The words Bina had said, the quiet dignity in her gratitude, it all hit him harder than anything he had felt in a long time. He had told her to pack her bags. He had told her to leave. But now, as the sound of the riders approached, something inside him cracked wide open. What had he done? The hoofbeats grew louder. 3 riders, Judson thought, maybe 4. And they weren't coming for supplies or neighborly conversation. They were coming for her. He glanced at Bina, small and brave, and packing her life into a worn carpet bag. And something inside him cracked clean through. What had he done? 3 months earlier, Judson Hale had been riding the fence line at dawn, inspecting the posts that had been damaged during the last storm. The cold Wyoming wind whipped against his face as he guided his horse slowly, methodically checking each fence, his mind preoccupied with the endless repairs that needed doing. As he rounded a bend in the fence line, something caught his eye, a body sprawled out near a broken post. His heart raced. A woman. She was collapsed on the ground, her face pale from sunburn, lips cracked, and her body so thin it seemed to be nothing but skin and bone. At first, Judson thought she might be dead, but when he dismounted and knelt beside her, he saw a faint rise and fall in her chest. His first instinct was to leave her there. It wasn't his problem. She was just another wanderer, likely someone who had gotten herself into trouble. But something in him paused. He wasn't a heartless man, and he had seen enough hardship in his life to know when a person had nothing left. With a grunt, he lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, and carried her to his cabin. It felt like an eternity before he reached the door, but he finally got her inside, laying her on the rough cot next to the hearth. For 3 days, Bina Merriweather didn't stir. She was too weak, too dehydrated to do much of anything. Judson didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't leave her to die out there. He kept a fire going, brought her water, and let her rest. When she woke up on the 3rd day, her eyes were wide with fear and confusion. She looked around, disoriented, but then focused on him, as if trying to remember who he was. She spoke haltingly, ashamed of her situation, explaining that she had been thrown out by her relatives after her mother's death. They had wanted her inheritance, land that had been passed down from her mother, but when she refused to give it to them, they'd cast her out into the wilderness. She had walked for days without food or water, trying to find shelter until she saw the broken fence and attempted to repair it. Judson listened without saying a word, his face impassive, but his mind was whirling. When she finished her story, he asked her simply, "You got anywhere else to go?" Bina shook her head. The answer was clear. She had nowhere. So, after a long silence, Judson made an offer. "You can work for your keep," he said, a pragmatic tone in his voice. He was no saint, but he had no desire to see anyone suffer needlessly. She would fix the fence, repair the gates, cook his meals, simple enough tasks for a woman who seemed willing to do anything to survive. She agreed immediately, her gratitude almost too much to bear. For the next several weeks, Bina worked tirelessly, mending the ranch as though it were her own. She repaired broken fence posts, reinforced corral gates, fixed the barn door, and patched the chicken coop. She cooked meals that, while simple, were always filling and nourishing. She cleaned without being asked, never complained, and always kept to herself. She stayed out of his way, out of his thoughts. But as the days passed, Judson found himself watching her more often than he liked to admit. Her work was impeccable, her skills far beyond what he had expected. She could fix a fence like a seasoned ranch hand, and she had an almost uncanny way of testing the tension on the wire, making sure everything was in perfect shape before moving on. It was clear that her mother had taught her well. He noticed the small things, the way she woke early in the morning to work on the north fence line, how she worked with a quiet, steady determination. At first, he ignored it, tried to remain distant, as he always had been. But it became harder. He found himself checking her fence repairs more often, even though he knew they would always be perfect. And when she wasn't around, the house felt empty, silent, as though the very air was missing something. It wasn't long before he began leaving small, unnoticed gestures of kindness. He gave her the quilt one cold night, leaving it on her bed without a word. At dinner, he made sure to give her the largest portion of food, even though he never acknowledged it. He pretended not to notice the way she barely ate, but it nagged at him. Late at night, when he heard the faint sound of crying from her corner of the cabin, he gritted his teeth and tried to ignore it. But no matter how much he tried to keep his distance, no matter how hard he worked to convince himself that it was just about survival, something had changed. Something inside him. It was small at first, an attraction, a connection he couldn't quite explain, but it grew with each passing day. And despite himself, despite the walls he had carefully built around his heart, he began to notice her in ways that went beyond what she could do for him. There was something more there, something he didn't know how to deal with. And then, yesterday, when he rode into town to pick up supplies, everything changed. He overheard a conversation at the saloon that shook him to his core. 3 men, rough-looking strangers with dangerous eyes, were asking about Bina. They wanted to know where she was, what ranch she might be working on. The mention of her name, of her family, sent a cold shiver down his spine. Luther Connolly, one of Bina's uncle's hired men, was leading the search. He wasn't looking for a family member to bring back. He was after something far more sinister. They were offering a reward, and Luther made it clear that Bina didn't have a choice in the matter. They wanted her to come back and sign over the land that had been her mother's. Judson had stood there, silent, his mind racing. He had never been a man to let anyone walk all over him. But this was different. Bina was a stranger, but he'd come to care for her in ways he couldn't admit. He'd begun to notice her, to care for her, and now he was faced with a reality he hadn't expected. He had to make a choice. And in that moment, standing in the dimly lit saloon, Judson knew he couldn't let her go back to those men. Not if it meant she'd lose everything. Not if it meant losing her. So, when he returned to the ranch, his mind was made up. It was time to send her away, to protect her, even if it meant breaking his own heart in the process. The next day, Judson rode into town, his mind clouded with the weight of his decision. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of the small town, and yet it felt like a heavy storm was brewing inside him. He had to prepare. He needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed to understand just how much trouble was coming. As he entered the saloon, the familiar smell of whiskey and tobacco filled the air, but the sight of 3 rough-looking men at the bar caught his attention. They were talking low, eyes flickering with suspicion and intent. Judson moved quietly to the counter, but he couldn't help overhearing. One of the men, tall with a scar running down his cheek, was talking about a girl, Bina. She's about 20, dark hair, ran off 3 months ago, the man said. Her uncle's offering a reward. Said she's working for some rancher out here, fixing fences. We'll find her. The leader of the group, a man named Luther Connolly, spoke with a cold certainty that made Judson's stomach churn. Family business, Luther said, glancing around the room. We'll bring her back, whether she likes it or not. Judson's fist clenched involuntarily as the bartender, a man named Jack, feigned ignorance. Haven't seen anyone like that around here, he lied. Luther didn't seem convinced, but he nodded. We'll find her. Don't worry. Judson stayed silent, his jaw tight, but the knot in his stomach only grew tighter. He couldn't afford for them to find Bina. He couldn't let her go back to that kind of life. As he stepped out into the street, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of the decision he'd made, the storm that was coming. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to care for her until now, how deeply he felt the need to protect her. But the truth was, sending her away, getting her out of harm's way, was the only way to keep her safe. The only way to protect her from those men who wouldn't hesitate to take her back by force. Judson didn't know what would happen when they arrived at his ranch, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let Bina go through that again. After he stopped by Mabel's mercantile for supplies, he stepped outside to find Mabel Granger, the town's busybody, waiting for him. She didn't even try to hide her concern. "You heard, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. "Those men are looking for her. People are already talking. The whole town knows you've been keeping that girl here. They're gonna make a fuss. Judson, people are already starting to wonder about you too." Her words stung, though he wasn't sure if it was the gossip or the fact that she was right. Mabel was no fool. She knew exactly what the town would say about a single man and a single woman living together, no matter the circumstances. "She works for her keep," Judson said, his voice clipped. Nothing more, but Mabel only nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I believe you," she said, though her expression made it clear that she knew the truth. "But you know how people talk. Those men, they look dangerous. Maybe you should think about sending her away before they find her." Before he could answer, a familiar voice called out from behind him. Sawyer Pike, the town's self-appointed moral compass, rode up on his horse, a smirk on his face. "Heard those fellas a skin about your fence girl," he said, his tone mocking. "Finally got yourself some help. Huh? What did you do? Trade her for a roof over her head?" Judson's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "Watch your mouth, Pike," he warned, though his anger was barely contained. "She's done nothing wrong." Sawyer's smirk only grew wider. "Town's watching Judson," he said. "Your reputation and hers. Maybe it's time you sent her on her way before those men find her." Judson didn't say anything as he climbed back onto his horse, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to let the town gossip ruin Bina's life. He had already made his decision, but now he wasn't so sure. If those men found her, they would destroy everything she had worked for, everything she had built. And he couldn't live with that. He couldn't let that happen to her. As he rode home, the weight of the decision bore down on him. He knew what he had to do. He had to send her away tonight. He would give her money for a horse, for passage to the next town, somewhere far away where no one knew her name. It was the only way to keep her safe. But the thought of her leaving, of her walking away from him for good, twisted something deep inside him. Sending her away wasn't just to protect her. It was also to protect himself. He couldn't afford to care for her. The more he thought about it, the more he knew he was only making it harder on both of them. He had to let her go. He had no choice. When he rode into the yard that evening, the decision was made. He would send her away. He'd give her the money, the directions, and the chance for a future that didn't involve him. It was the only way to keep her safe. But as he walked into the cabin and saw her sitting at the workbench, carefully repairing the fence tools, the words "pack your things" felt like they were lodged in his throat, hard and unforgiving. It wasn't the right thing to say, but it was the only thing he could bring himself to say. He had no other choice. The sun had begun to set, casting long, stretching shadows across the ranch as Judson stood at the window, rigid and distant, watching the darkening horizon. Bina had her few belongings packed, the worn carpet bag by her side, and her fence repair tools cleaned and neatly arranged. She stood motionless for a moment, her back straight, hands steady despite the circumstances, her quiet dignity somehow sharper in the silence between them. Judson didn't know what to say. He had planned this moment over and over in his mind, but now that it was here, the words seemed too heavy, too final. "Bina," he began, but his voice faltered, the confession that had been on the tip of his tongue slipping away. He couldn't say it. couldn't find the words to make this easier for either of them. She waited, hope flickering in her eyes, but Judson turned away. He couldn't bear to see that hope. "Never mind. Just go," he said, the words harsh even to his own ears. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, and he could hear the soft rustle of her packing her things one last time. Then the sound of hooves getting closer, faster, unmistakable. Judson's breath caught in his throat. They were here, the riders. 3, maybe 4 of them, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. They were here for her. He could feel the weight of their arrival pressing in on him. With a deep breath, he reached for the rifle by the door, the cold metal familiar in his hands, though he wasn't aiming it yet. He simply stepped out onto the porch, standing tall, prepared for whatever came next. The riders approached, their horses kicking up the dust, the air growing thick with tension. Luther Connolly, the leader, dismounted first, a sly smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We're looking for Bina Merriweather," Luther said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting what he wanted. "Her uncle sent us to bring her home. Family business." Judson didn't flinch. He met Luther's gaze with a cool, unwavering stare. "There's no one by that name here," Judson said flatly, his voice calm, though every muscle in his body was tight, ready for anything. Luther's eyes narrowed, the smile never fading. "Bartender in town said otherwise," Luther remarked. "Said you've had a girl working here for the past few months. Dark hair, good with fences, about 20 years old. Sounds like a match to me." Judson's grip tightened on the rifle, but he didn't move. "Hired hand left yesterday," he said, his tone steady, unshaken. "She headed east." Luther's smirk deepened, but his next words were slow, calculating. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be sure." Judson's stance didn't waver, his voice firm. "I mind plenty. Now, get off my land." Just as the tension seemed ready to snap, Bina stepped out of the cabin, her small figure framed by the door. Her eyes locked with Judson's, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She didn't want to run anymore. She wasn't going to let him lie for her, not when it meant risking his life and her own. With quiet resolve, she took a step forward, the hammer of her fence tool still in her hand, a symbol of the work she'd done, of the woman she had become. "I'm Bina Merriweather," she said, her voice steady but strong. Judson's heart sank as he heard her words, his chest tight, the reality of their situation crashing over him. "Get back inside," he growled, but Bina stood firm. She wasn't going to back down. She'd already been running for too long. No more running. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice clear and unyielding. Luther's smile turned cold, his eyes dark with threat. "Your uncle wants you home, girl," he said. "You've got property to sign over, a debt to pay for raising you." Bina didn't flinch, her eyes never leaving his. "That land was my mother's gift to me," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I owe nothing." Luther's tone shifted, darker now. "Not how your uncle sees it," he spat. His hand moved toward his gun belt. "You'll come back and sign, willing or not." Judson's heart raced. He stepped forward, blocking Bina from their line of sight, his rifle raised now, aimed directly at Luther. "Over my dead body," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. The air between them crackled with danger, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing would move. The wind whipped around them, carrying the sound of distant coyotes. And then, just as it felt like the world might come crashing down, Judson said something that froze everyone in place. "Besides," he added, his voice quieter but stronger than ever, "you can't take her. She's my fiancée." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and Bina's eyes widened in shock. Luther's expression faltered, just for a moment, before he regained his composure. The standoff continued, and Judson, for the first time, felt the raw, jagged edge of his emotions. He had said it to save her, to protect her, but in that moment, he realized it was more than just a lie. It was the truth, even if neither of them had dared to admit it before. And as the wind howled louder, everything shifted. Nothing was the same. The air seemed to freeze in place as Luther and his men took a step back, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. But Judson stood firm, his rifle still aimed at Luther, unwavering. Bina, still standing beside him, felt the weight of the lies settle between them like a heavy truth they both knew couldn't be taken back. Luther's voice cut through the tension, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Fiancé," he repeated, his lips curling into a sneer. "Convenient timing, Hale." Judson didn't flinch. He held Luther's gaze with a quiet intensity. "We've been engaged for weeks," he said firmly, the words coming out with an authority he didn't feel but knew he had to project. "That property? It'll be mine by marriage soon enough." He took a step forward, his stance protective and sure. "So take your threats and ride back to her uncle with the news. This is over." Luther's suspicion only deepened, but he didn't press the issue immediately. "Funny," he said, his eyes flicking to the other men. "I didn't hear about any engagement when I was in town. No one said a word about it." Judson's reply was quick, delivered without hesitation. "We're private people," he said coolly. Didn't see the need to announce it. He paused, letting the words settle in the air. "But we're marrying as soon as the circuit preacher comes through. So, I suggest you leave." Now, Bina, her heart racing, didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The enormity of what Judson was saying hit her all at once. She hadn't expected him to stand up for her, much less lie so convincingly to these men. Her own voice was barely a whisper as she added, "That's right. We're to be married." She slipped her hand into his, and for a moment, everything felt real, too real. Judson's hand closed around hers with a firmness that sent a spark of warmth through her. It wasn't a gesture of protection, not just to keep her safe from the men outside. It was something more, something deeper. Luther, still skeptical, wasn't ready to let this lie go without a challenge. He crossed his arms, his eyes dark with doubt. "If you're really engaged," Luther pressed, "you'd know things about her. Things only a fiancé would know. Tell me something I wouldn't know." Judson's mind raced, but the answer came easily. He didn't have to think twice. "She fixes fences better than most men I've hired," he began, his voice steady. "Uses a crossbar technique her mother taught her. Always tests the tension on the wire twice before securing it. Takes her coffee with honey, not sugar. Has a small scar on her left hand from a fence nail. Checks every gate she repairs 3 times before moving on. Works on the north fence line at dawn because the light's best." Bina's heart skipped a beat with each detail he shared. She had no idea he had been paying such close attention to her, noticing things she thought no one ever would. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, her throat tight. Luther's skepticism wavered. His gaze shifted to his companions, who exchanged uncertain looks. One of them muttered under his breath, "Sounds like he knows her pretty well." For a long moment, the silence stretched out, thick and heavy, and Judson stood tall, unblinking, as though daring Luther to challenge him further. The men seemed to be taking it in, the truth of the situation slowly sinking in. But Luther, though clearly rattled, wasn't ready to back down. "Her uncle won't be pleased," Luther muttered, his eyes flashing with menace. "He won't take kindly to being lied to." Judson didn't flinch. "I don't much care what he's pleased about," he replied with a calm finality. "Once we're married, that property is protected by law, so you can take your threats and leave. I'm not giving her up." Luther's face darkened, his jaw tightening, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the standoff. Judson's heart raced as he turned, eyes narrowing in the growing dusk. From the direction of the road came Sawyer Pike, the town's resident troublemaker, riding up with 2 ranch hands behind him. The numbers had suddenly evened out. Sawyer tipped his hat, giving Judson a pointed look. "Everything all right here, Judson," he called out, his tone a little too casual for the circumstances. Luther's eyes flicked to Sawyer, and then to the other 2 men, all of them armed. The odds were now against him. The other riders exchanged glances, weighing their options. Luther's expression twisted with frustration, but he didn't make a move. This isn't over. Luther spat, but the threat was weaker now, his confidence shaken by the unexpected turn of events. With a final glance at Bina and Judson, Luther turned to mount his horse, signaling for the other two men to follow. "We'll be back with lawyers," he called over his shoulder. "We'll see you in court." The three men rode off into the gathering darkness, their retreat abrupt and unsatisfying. Sawyer tipped his hat to Judson, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Congrats on the engagement," he said with a wink before spurring his horse and riding off, his two ranch hands following suit. The yard fell silent once more, but the air was charged with the weight of what had just happened. Bina, still holding Judson's hand, looked up at him, her heart racing. They had won for now, but the danger wasn't over. The real fight, she knew, was just beginning. She turned to him, her voice soft but steady. "Did you mean it?" she asked, the question hanging between them, vulnerable and raw. Judson looked down at her, his chest tight, his throat dry. He had told the lie to save her. But now, with the threat gone, the truth was impossible to ignore. The lie had become something else, something real, something that had taken root deep inside both of them. And as he looked into her eyes, he knew he couldn't pretend anymore. He had meant every word. Bina's question hung in the air between them like a challenge and a plea all at once. "Did you mean it?" she repeated softly, her eyes searching his face for an answer she wasn't sure she could trust. Judson stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing as if the words he needed to say were somehow caught in his throat, tangled up with every fear, every doubt he'd tried to bury for so long. He had ordered her to leave earlier that night, told her to pack her things, because he had been terrified, not of the men coming for her, not of the danger that loomed on the horizon, but of the emotions he had been trying to keep at bay. He had been trying to protect her, to keep her safe from everything, including himself. But now, standing there, facing her in the dimming light, he knew that protecting her had meant something more than just sending her away. It had meant lying to himself, pretending that the growing feelings he had for her didn't matter, that the way she had slowly inched her way into his life, into his heart, was something he could ignore. His voice broke as he turned to face her. "I told you to pack your things tonight," he started, his words raw, "stood right there and ordered you gone. You know why?" Bina shook her head, her eyes wide, her heart in her throat. Judson didn't wait for an answer. "Because I was terrified," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not of those men, of what I feel for you." He paused, his chest tight with the weight of his own confession. "I found you dying by my broken fence and told myself it was just Christian duty," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Gave you work and told myself it was practical. But then," he stopped, swallowed hard, as if the words themselves were too much to bear. "Then I started noticing things," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "The way you fix fences like it's an art. The way you test every post twice. How you wake at dawn to work on the north line because the light's better. How the ranch runs smoother when you're here. How I find excuses to check your fence work, even though it's always perfect. How the place feels empty when you're not fixing something." His voice broke, and it scared me half to death. Bina's eyes filled with tears, the depth of his confession washing over her like a tide. She took a small step forward, her heart swelling with something she hadn't dared to hope for. "You think you're the only one scared?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. She wiped away a tear, but her gaze never left his. "I fell in love with you the night you gave me the quilt," she admitted, her voice soft but clear. "I pretended to be asleep, but I felt you watching. I felt you care, even though you fought it." Her tears spilled freely now, but her voice remained steady. "Every day since, I've loved you. Every fence I fixed, every gate I repaired. Not because you ordered it, but because I wanted to. I want to make this place better. I wanted to be part of your life, even just the edges of it. She shook her head, her chest tight with the weight of her fears. But I knew it couldn't last. Girls like me don't get happy endings. Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, as she looked up at him, waiting for him to say something, anything. Judson's heart cracked wide open, the weight of her pain too much for him to bear. He couldn't let her think that way. He stepped toward her, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. "What if we made the lie true?" he asked quietly. Bina's breath caught in her throat, and her heart raced. "I'm asking you properly now, Bina," he continued, his voice low but full of sincerity. "Not to save you from them, but because I can't face another day sending you away. Will you marry me?" The simplicity of his words, the rawness of his question, hit her like a flood. She could barely breathe, her eyes wide with shock, hope, and something else, something she hadn't dared to let herself feel until now. "Will you marry me?" he asked again, his voice steady, but his eyes pleading for an answer. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The air was thick with the weight of their confessions, the promise of a future they had both been too afraid to claim. Bina's lips parted, but before she could speak, the unmistakable sound of a cocking rifle echoed in the stillness of the evening, freezing them both in place. Touching, Luther's voice came from the shadows, low and cold. "But I'm afraid there won't be any wedding." The sound of the rifle cocking sent a chill through the air, freezing Bina and Judson in place. Luther's voice, cold and mocking, came from the shadows. "Touching," he sneered, "but I'm afraid there won't be any wedding." Bina's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the dark corner of the barn where Luther stood, the gleam of the rifle's barrel catching the last of the fading light. Judson's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he instinctively stepped in front of her, positioning himself as a barrier between Bina and the threat in front of him. He didn't know if he was more afraid for her, for himself, or for what they had just built in that brief moment of truth. Luther's smirk didn't waver as he took a slow step forward, the gun aimed at Judson's chest, but Judson stood tall, unwavering, determined. "You'll have to kill me first," Judson growled, his voice low and steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Luther chuckled darkly, his hand tightening on the rifle's stock. "That can be arranged," he said, a cruel edge to his words. The world seemed to hold its breath, the stillness of the moment broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the grass. Judson's heart pounded in his chest, the tension building with every passing second. Bina's hands shook, but she didn't move. She stood there, helpless, watching Judson as though he were the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. Her gaze was filled with a mixture of fear, admiration, and something deeper, something she had never dared to say aloud. But then, just as the air seemed to crack under the weight of their standoff, a loud shotgun blast rang through the night, shattering the silence. The force of the blast was enough to make them all flinch, and for a brief moment, the tension was broken. Luther's eyes widened in surprise, his rifle lowering slightly as he whipped around to face the new threat. Standing on the other side of the yard, shotgun raised and smoking in the air, was none other than Sawyer Pike, the town's notorious troublemaker. He had a grin on his face, but his eyes were sharp, focused, and determined. Behind him, two more ranch hands appeared, armed and ready. The numbers had suddenly shifted. Sawyer's voice was calm, but his words carried a quiet, dangerous weight. "Thought you might try something sneaky," he said, his eyes fixed on Luther. "Looks like I was right." The other ranch hands, men Judson knew by reputation, took their positions, forming a loose circle around Luther and his crew. From further down the road, the sound of approaching horses could be heard, and soon more townspeople began to arrive. Mabel Granger, the blacksmith, and even the bartender from the saloon. Judson's heart skipped as he realized that the entire town had come to their defense. Luther, seeing the shift in the odds, took a step back, his hand still gripping his rifle, but with a new wariness in his eyes. You're outnumbered, Luther, Sawyer said, his voice hard. The town looks after its own, and Bina's one of us now. The words landed heavily in the air, and for the first time, Luther seemed to realize the weight of his situation. His face twisted with anger, but he knew he couldn't win this fight. You'll regret this, Luther spat, his voice low and threatening. All of you. He turned to his men, his eyes dark with frustration, and motioned for them to mount their horses. We'll be back, Luther muttered, and next time, there won't be anyone to stop us. Without another word, the three men rode off, their figures disappearing into the night, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The tension in the air didn't completely dissipate, but for the first time that night, Judson allowed himself to exhale. Sawyer lowered his shotgun and gave Judson a wry smile. "Congrats on the engagement," he said, tipping his hat with a mock formality before spurring his horse into motion and riding off, his two ranch hands following close behind. The yard, once tense with the threat of violence, now felt strangely calm, the quiet only broken by the distant sound of the wind and the soft rustling of leaves. Bina, still holding Judson's hand, looked up at him, her heart racing as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The danger wasn't over, but for now, they had won. Luther and his men had been sent packing, and the town had rallied behind them in a way Bina hadn't dared to believe possible. She turned to Judson, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you mean it?" she asked again, her voice trembling with the uncertainty of a moment. Judson's eyes softened as he looked down at her, the weight of everything they had just been through settling in his chest. He took a deep breath, his hand still holding hers, and then nodded. "I did," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I meant every word. And I don't want to lose you, Bina. Not now. Not ever." She smiled up at him, her heart overflowing with emotion. The world felt different now, less uncertain, more hopeful, more real. In that moment, everything changed. The path ahead of them wasn't clear, but they were no longer alone in it. They had each other, and for the first time in months, Bina allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be a future for them both. 3 days later, the circuit preacher arrived, and a small ceremony was held at the ranch. It was simple, with only a handful of townspeople present, but it was everything they both needed. The vows were traditional, but heartfelt, and as Bina gazed up at Judson, the man who had once ordered her to leave and now stood beside her as her husband, she knew that their love, though complicated and fraught with difficulty, was real. They kissed, soft and sweet, but filled with promise, and the townspeople cheered. Even Sawyer, who had once mocked Judson, shouted, "About time you made an honest woman of her." The celebration that followed was modest, but the laughter and warmth of the gathered friends felt like a dream. Bina no longer felt like an outsider. She finally belonged. That evening, after the guests had left and the ranch settled into a peaceful quiet, Bina moved her things into Judson's room, their room. No longer would she sleep on the floor, far from him. As she moved her fence tools to a corner of the room, Judson watched her from the doorway. "Regret not packing those bags?" he asked softly. She smiled, her heart full, and shook her head. "Only if you regret not letting me go." Judson crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Never, not for a second." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Bina glanced around the room at the ranch she had made her own, the fences she had repaired, the gates she had secured. All of it was theirs now, no longer just his, but theirs. "So no more orders to fix the fence and pack your bags?" she asked, her voice light with teasing. Judson smiled, the rarest of expressions, and leaned in to kiss her. "Just fix the fence and stay forever," he whispered. "I can do that," she whispered back. As they kissed again, longer this time, and the future ahead seemed brighter than ever before. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the prairie, carrying away old sorrows and leaving room for new joy. The fences Bina had repaired now enclosed not just land, but a future they would build together, brick by brick, post by post. Bina Hale was finally truly home.